A Story of Magic Strawberries. A short story by Enid Blyton. Narration by Kenneth de Silva. Once upon a time there lived a king called Framboy, who was very, very rich. He loved money. He was very greedy, very mean, and very cunning. His people were made to give him money for this and money for that, until they became very poor and could afford nothing but the cheapest things to eat and the poorest things to wear. They did not dare to grumble, for if they did, the king told his soldiers to take them to prison, and off they went. King Framboy was fat, for he loved food. He always dressed himself in the grandest clothes, for though he was mean, he was also vain. He loved to drive through the city in his golden carriage, drawn by 12 white horses, and see all his poor people bowing to him. Then he felt very grand indeed. "I am a wonderful king," he thought. "No other king has as much money as I do, or can dress so finely." Now it happened one day that a stranger came to the country of King Framboy. He was an odd little fellow, dressed in brown and green, with the merriest twinkling eyes you could imagine. He played jolly tunes on a flute, and sounded just like a happy blackbird. He walked happily up the village street, whistling on his flute, and all the folk peeped out to see him. "Come out and dance to my music," he cried, and played a merry jig. One by one the people came out, but they were so poorly clad and so thin that the flute player stared. "Why do you starve yourselves so?" he cried. "Surely your fields provide you with food to fatten your cheeks and put dancing on your feet?" "Our king takes most of our money," whispered a woman to him, "and what is left is barely enough to keep ourselves." The flute player looked sad as he went to the next village. He stopped and looked at the tumble-down cottages. "Hey, folk!" he cried. "Why don't you mend your houses?" And then he played such a merry tune that all the villagers came out to hear. But he couldn't make them dance. It is only happy people who can dance, and they were some of the saddest people in the whole world. "We don't have enough money to get our houses mended," they told him. "The king takes so much from us, and we dare not refuse him." The little man looked sadder still. He spent the night at the village and heard much more before he set off on his journey again the next day. Soon he arrived at the king's city. As he was walking through it, he heard a great trumpeting, and down the street came the king in his golden carriage, looking very splendid, very fat, and very rich. The flute player stood and stared at him. "You are vain," he thought, "and you are fat and greedy. You are also rich. Now, how can I use these things for the good of your people?" He went away and thought. Then a smile came over his face, and he chuckled. He went to a strawberry field, and for 2 pieces of silver was allowed to pick the biggest strawberries he could see. They were very ripe and very red, and soon the flute player had an enormous basket full of the biggest strawberries that had ever been seen. Then he put them down in a corner of the field and blew a magical tune over them, and all the time he smiled and smiled. That afternoon he took the basket of strawberries to the street outside the palace and walked up and down crying, "Strawberries! Strawberries! Juicy and sweet! The finest in the world! Strawberries, strawberries!" The king happened to hear him shouting and went to the window. He saw the basket of delicious strawberries and his mouth watered. He was very fond of strawberries. "Ask that fellow how much his strawberries are," commanded the king. A footman ran down the street. "Tell his majesty that I paid 2 pieces of gold for them, and I want 3, for I had to pick them in the hot sun," answered the flute player. The footman told that to the king. Much too dear, said his Majesty. The fellow is nothing but a cheat. Go down and tell him I will give him 1 piece of gold, and even that is too much. The footman went down and told the flute player. I'm sorry, he said, but the strawberries are mine to sell at what price I choose, and 3 pieces of gold is the price. When the king was told this answer, he grew angry. He meant to have the strawberries, but he didn't mean to pay anything like such a high price as 3 pieces of gold for them. Tell the fellow to bring them up, and I will pay him, he said. So the flute player brought his big basket of strawberries to the king. Footmen set them out in a great gold dish, and put them in front of King Framboy, who began to eat them at once. You will hardly believe it, but he ate them all, every single one. When he had finished, he held out just 1 single piece of silver to the flute player. Here, he said, they are not worth 3 pieces of gold. They are not even worth 1 piece of gold. Take the silver piece and begone. Your Majesty, said the flute player sternly, I want my 3 pieces of gold. The king frowned angrily. Soldiers, seize him and put him out, he cried. But before the flute player could be seized, he put his flute to his lips and played a strange little tune. Then he laughed, bowed, and ran from the palace. King Framboy was just going to order his soldiers to go after him, when he felt something creaking inside his head. He felt very funny. Something strange was happening to his head. Could it be growing bigger? No, things like that don't happen suddenly, thought the king, puzzled and frightened. Then he looked at his soldiers. They were all staring at him in the greatest surprise and astonishment. Then, one by one, they turned away from him to hide their smiles. King Framboy got up and went across to the mirror. What he saw there made him stare with horror and amazement. His head was shaped just like a big strawberry. There were his little eyes, his big nose, and his mean mouth, just as usual. But dear me, they seemed quite lost in his great strawberry-shaped head that sat on his collar, as if it were ready to be picked. It's magic, he gasped. Those strawberries were magic. Fetch that flute player, quickly. The soldiers rushed out, laughing, and hunted for the flute player. They soon found him and brought him back, taking care to be very polite, in case he decided to use his magic on them, as well as on the king. When the king saw him, he roared at him. Strawberry seller, what do you mean by this? Do you want to be put in prison for the rest of your life? No, answered the little man, smiling. Ha! Excuse my laughing, but you do look funny. Your people will smile for once when they see you now. See me? I'll never let them see me like this, shouted the king. Use your magic and make my head become its proper shape. No, said the flute player. It is a punishment for you. The king almost choked. He was so angry. Off with his head, he cried to the soldiers. Off with his head. Remember, said the flute player, whatever you do with my head will not alter yours. I am the only person who can take the spell away, and if you kill me, you will be strawberry-headed for the rest of your life. You will forever be known as King Strawberry Head. The king sat silent. It was true. This little flute player was the only one who could undo what he had done. He certainly mustn't kill him. Leave me alone to speak with this man, said the king at last to his soldiers. They went from the room. The king stared at the little man. Here are 4 gold pieces, he said. That is 1 more than you asked for. Take them and cure me quickly. The little man laughed at that. I want more than that, he said. I want half the gold you have in your treasury. The king was too astonished to speak. What did the fellow mean? Was he mad? No, I'm not mad, said the flute player, reading the king's thoughts. I want half the gold in your treasury. But goodness gracious, you don't suppose I'd give you that much, do you? Squealed the king in anger. You would completely ruin me. Stuff and nonsense, answered the flute player. You are the richest man in the world, and your people are the poorest folk on earth. You take their money to hoard for yourself, to buy your grand robes, and to feed your great appetite. Your people live in hovels and eat little. They do not have any dancing in their feet, nor laughter in their eyes. I'd say you should be ashamed, King Framboy. The king grew red all over his great strawberry-shaped face. It's not true, he said. But I say it is, said the little man. You big, rich, vain, greedy thing. How everyone will laugh at you. The king felt very sorry for himself. Whatever in the world was he to do? He hated the idea of giving so much away to that horrid little strawberry seller. Put on your coat and wrap up your head in my scarf, said the flute player to King Framboy suddenly. I want to take you outside and show you a few things. No, no, cried the king. I won't go out like this. You will, said the little man, and the king did. He was taken through the city. The flute player showed him this and that, the thin children and the poorly dressed men and women, the sullen faces and the sad eyes. He heard how the people grumbled about him, and how much he was hated. Nobody knew that this big man with the odd-shaped head was the king. King Framboy's ears began to burn, and he wanted to go away and hide. How awful to be hated like that. I didn't know, he whispered to the flute player. I didn't know. No, you were too wrapped up in your selfishness to bother about anything else, said the little man scornfully. When they were back at the palace, the flute player looked at the king. Well, he said, what about that money? Are you going to give it to me? What would you do with it? Asked the king. Give it back to your people, was the answer. It rightfully belongs to them. The king sat for a long time without saying anything. I ought to do that, not you, he said at last. If I took it from them, then it is I who should give it back. I will treat my people better in the future, and perhaps I may win their love. Suddenly, he stopped speaking and put his hands to his head. Something was happening. Whatever was it? Is my head growing larger? Cried the king. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. He rushed to the mirror and gazed in it in astonishment. Why, he cried, it's all right again. It's the same shape that it was this morning. The spell has been broken. You broke it yourself, said the flute player, smiling at him. I wish you good evening. My work is done. And to the astonishment of the king, he went gaily dancing from the room, playing on his flute the merriest tune ever heard, and vanished in the darkness outside. King Framboy sat and felt his head, and thought. And the result of his deep thinking was that he took half of all his gold and gave it back to the people. More than that, he promised he would treat them well and rule them kindly, and he kept his word. He wondered if his soldiers remembered his strawberry-shaped head, but when he asked them, they looked puzzled and said no. They could remember nothing so strange as that. Then the king wondered if he had had a dream, and offered a large reward to anyone who would bring him news of a little flute player dressed in brown and green. But no one ever did, and the flute player has never been heard of from that day to this. And though nobody could think why, King Framboy never ate strawberries again. But I expect you could easily guess the reason, couldn't you?